Hi, how are we all doing? It's Tim Guy. I'm here to talk about some of my responses to some of the questions asked for us for Module 6. I read through all the resources, and I'm kind of giving some of my opinions and some of my thoughts about some of the things we've read in terms of applying it to a lesson that we've talked about before. Just a real quick review back to Module 3. I posted a lesson that was about trig functions, specifically the trig function tangent. The lesson, kind of what it started with, was students would explore some of the lengths of the sides of a similar right triangle, and they would measure the different sides of different similar triangles and realize that the ratio between those sides was always the same. And that would then lead to, once they made that discovery, we come back and do a group discussion and basically discuss that ratio is known as tangent when you have a leg, the opposite leg over the adjacent leg, and that ratio will always be the same because of similar triangles, and kind of make some connections to previous things we learned in geometry. I then would show some students how to do that in terms of what the applications would look like in terms of problems for them to do, and then they would do some sort of independent practice. I think back in Module 3, I talked about incorporating Nearpod to do some guided practice in terms of here's some problems for you guys to do, and then have them kind of work together and kind of comment on each other's work and what's good work and what's bad work and some of those sorts of things. So one of the first things is how I prepare students to collaborate. I think it's really important that if you're going to incorporate student interaction in your classroom, which you should, because that's been shown to be awesome for students, you really need to kind of work with students beforehand to make sure that they know what's expected of them within that environment. One thing is that in my lesson, to make sure that the students are going to be successful for collaborating, I would want to first make sure that I'm developing some positive interdependence with them. And one way I think to do that is to assign roles and kind of give students either the specific things that you're in charge of. That way they kind of see the value of each person within their team, and somebody doesn't get just kind of kicked off to the side, like, hey, you're not really that helpful, maybe you're not the smartest kid at this, maybe you're just not getting this right away, and we're just going to ignore you. Making sure that each student has a role and making them be in charge of that role makes it so that every student kind of has something important to bring to the lesson. Another thing that I would try to do is just to build some of the small group skills within students. Before the lesson would start, and really just for my classroom in general, I would have practice group discussions. I would talk about these are the kind of things I'd want, and really model what those interactions look like, whether it be me showing or, during a practice group session, say, hey, this group, let's look at what they did because they did a really nice job discussing this is what we should be doing whenever we're doing some sort of collaboration. And the last bit is that I want to build individual accountability in my students, and one way to do that is to have them do some sort of reflection after the lesson. I can kind of go stronger that too and say some sort of individual assessment for them in terms of what they did, and this kind of ties again back into the roles part. If they are assigned a specific role after the lesson, the reflection can be, how did you succeed at that role? Did your group do well at this? Why or why not? What were some limitations? And that just kind of holds kids accountable for themselves and know, hey, if I want to be part of the greater group, I need to make sure that I am pulling my own individual weight as part of this collaborative session. Some of the benefits of collaboration just in general and in this specific lesson. Number one, I think that it can build connection among your students and a sense of community. I include in my physical classroom a lot of student collaboration where they work together. And what's awesome to see is that, one, you can, depending on your grouping, get students who might not normally work together kind of communicating, and it just makes your whole classroom a lot closer and a lot more together. And what it really builds among them is those relationships where they're then willing to, outside of a collaborative experience, go and ask other students for help and ask for questions, really become a lot more more independent than just being dependent on me as the teacher. And I think that sort of thing is just so important. Another thing is that I can find that it can lead to a deeper understanding of the topic, and that's more specific for this lesson. I think that the collaborative portion is kind of at the beginning where they're doing that exploration piece, and just by having them kind of bounce ideas off each other and kind of explore and notice that, hey, every time I do these measurements, I'm not getting the same measurements, but the ratio ratios are the same every time, what's going on, why would that be? And that kind of helps build a deeper understanding about what's going on, as opposed to if I just came in the front of the room and said, hey, here's tangent, it's opposite over adjacent, here's what you do. So I think that building that deeper understanding, obviously getting the students to know the content is one of the most important things whenever we're teaching a subject. And then last but not least, this was something in one of the articles that we had to read online that they talked about how we need to make sure our students are becoming better learners, not just good students. And I think that with the collaboration, you kind of can start to harbor some of that lifelong learning tendencies that you might miss out on in just doing traditional lessons every single time you go out. And that I think it's really important to get students questioning each other, getting used to questioning each other, getting used to discussing things with each other. Hey, when there's something I'm, trying to learn, how do I talk about it with somebody else? And I think those things are really important for building those better learners in your classroom. Some of the challenges that I think with this lesson, and just in general, especially in an online environment, I think it can be hard to notice when a group member maybe is not pulling their weight. And obviously having that sort of reflection piece at the end, and maybe some of those individual assessments can kind of pull that out. But, even in my own physical classroom, it can be difficult sometimes to notice when that group member is kind of just sliding along. And I can only imagine the difficulties in an online environment where you may have students split into different chat rooms to do whatever sort of collaboration you're doing, and you may not be able to be with each kind of group at all times. Another one, again, kind of ties into that as well, is kind of the student who dominates conversation. Other students can kind of feel left out when you have that student who just kind of takes over and says, hey, this is how it's done, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I need to do. And again, some of the things that I would try to do to counteract that is the assigning of roles and things, but that still can be a difficult thing. Some students will just overstep those boundaries sometimes, and I can see the difficulty, again, splitting in different chat rooms and doing a collaborative piece. It might be really hard to notice that that's going on in an online environment. Also, just having students make the correct conclusion, in those groups. Obviously, group discussion is awesome, but if the whole group is kind of going off the wrong path, then it kind of becomes almost self-destructive. So it's really important to be kind of listening and kind of inputting to kind of gear that discussion towards the correct direction where I want it to go. And also, just anytime you do something online, technology, cooperating, whenever you're doing something collaborative, it's going to involve a little bit more than if you just sort of posted a video and had students respond, or if you just did a traditional lesson on a virtual classroom. Splitting kids in chat rooms, it might not work out perfectly. If you have students doing some sort of interactive technology, whether that be something like Nearpod or ClassKick or GoFormative or any of those sorts of things, those things can sometimes crash and not work on you. So really, it's really important to us to have backup plans for if this doesn't work, here's another way I can get the same sort of collaboration out of my students. For information anxiety and what are some of the things I think I can use to prevent it? For this lesson in specific, I'm not that concerned about information anxiety. This is, just kind of a specific topic, and it's not very big, and sort of the collaborative piece is more of like an exploration to bring into what we're going to be talking about. So I'm not so worried about just overwhelming my students with things, but in general, and especially when I talk about my examples here at the end where I'm going to kind of maybe expand the lesson a little bit, I think it's important to just be clear with your students and provide them with some outlines of these are the really important things. So if you're feeling overwhelmed, these are the main things I want you to focus on. And then just to really help students throughout the entire year and throughout your course on how to organize information, how to keep everything together, how to know when something's really important and when it's not, what are the things you really need to study or not, and then also just be available to students. If a student is feeling overwhelmed, make sure that they know what resources are out there for them, whether that be office hours in an online environment where they can come and talk to you, or maybe some other services that are available through whatever cyber charter school or whatever you're working through. So it's really important to just tell students what's available and make sure that you're available for your students. So some ways that I think I could expand this lesson to add some more collaboration or some more things to the lesson. The first one is to incorporate sort of a group project at the end. This could sort of be maybe the assessment piece for the unit in general. So going beyond just the tangent lesson, maybe after we talk about sine and cosine, have this be sort of the big formative assessment for students. So basically I would have students work in groups and do a project-based assessment, and they would have to research some real-life uses and applications of trig functions. And just some off the top of my head that I know, or there's architecture, they use anything that involves triangles. So architecture, engineering, there's lots of things where people in real life actually calculate using trig functions. And then they would present their information on what they found and maybe some specific examples that were interesting to them. And, I really think that this is a really cool idea for a formative assessment, because I could have the students do some calculations and show me they understand what they're talking about, but they also get to see some of the things, why we're learning it and why it's important and what it's actually used for. A librarian in this instance could really be somebody who provides resources for students. They could be somebody who says, hey, here's some things I have about some architecture that uses triangles, or here's somebody who really, in their, whenever they build something, they really use triangles, or why do we use triangles for like bridge supports and things, and they can really provide some of that and kind of help students guide their research. And then in terms of community, I could kind of at the end kind of bring in somebody who's a local engineer architect, who they could bring in their own piece of, hey, here is what I'm actually using with this, and that way they can kind of see what they've researched versus what's actually happening in somebody's life who uses this. And really, this kind of phrase down here, I'm going to kind of bring my mouse down if you can see it. This phrase right here, I saw this in one of the online articles we had to read, and I really like the wording here, the rooted relevance. Making sure that what we're talking about has some sort of meaning to a student and maybe kind of makes them interested to explore it further. And I think this is an example of a way to get students to see, oh, this is kind of what something that's actually being used for. If I'm taking a geometry course in high school, maybe that means I'm interested in these sorts of things, and maybe it's something I want to look into further and kind of make it relevant to your students. The number 2 idea I had was to kind of change the lesson and unit up to be sort of a jigsaw activity. So that would involve students kind of teaching each other about the different trig functions. So they would have to give each other examples and to give each other just all the different information that would normally be provided from me. And they'd work in groups to do that, and they'd have to come up with these sort of lessons. And I really think that this is another great way to have students not just collaborating among themselves to create the lessons, but also kind of get the idea of being the teacher, where they have to teach and answer questions from their other students who are not part of their group. And it really gets the whole classroom kind of working together. And I find this to be really effective, especially if you want to get students helping each other later on. And some things that the librarian can help with, they can show students some different interactive technology resources. So I have ClassTig, Nearpod, GoFormative, different things where students can do examples and other students can kind of answer what's going on and show their work. And I'll link those in when I post this as well. So if you want to check those out, they're really awesome resources to do some online collaboration and interaction. And then also as a community, students could have to bring into their part of their lesson is, hey, here's something in, the community around me. Here's something in the real world where they're actually using whatever I'm talking about. So maybe they can see, hey, they're building a new bridge down the road, and they are using triangles as part of their design, and here's the actual measurements, and some of those sorts of things to kind of see, like, hey, here's things around us that are being used, and get students really talking about their local environment that other students in an online course maybe won't share with them. It really brings some interesting ideas in and some different looks at life. So thank you. If you have any questions for me, just let me know. So thank you for watching my video.